Welcome to the Press On podcast. It is our goal to encourage you through simple spiritual conversation to press on in your walk with Christ. My name is Kyle Blevins, and I'm joined today by my friend Elijah Spillman as we discuss the flood narrative of Genesis chapter 6 through chapter 9. That conversation is already underway, so let's go ahead and join in. So the story of the flood is part of a larger narrative that the Bible is revealing, which has primarily shown us that man is really good at rebelling against God. I mean, you go back to the beginning, Adam and Eve, God, he creates everything, and when he does, he tells them it is good. And then he tells them there's a tree in the midst of the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat from this tree. And that's exactly the decision they end up making. They listen to the serpent and they eat from the tree, and more or less they decide, we want to be like God. We want to be the ones that can decide if something is good or evil. And ever since then, what we've done is shown we're not very good at deciding what's good and evil. You follow that up with Cain. Cain kills his brother. Lamech, a descendant of Cain, basically says, I want to be even more evil than Cain. So it's just a continuing picture of rebellion and failure of mankind until you get to Genesis 6. And it seems God looks down on this. He comes to this point where he says, I'm sorry that I've made man. And then he makes this statement in Genesis 6 to Noah in verse 13, the end of all flesh has come before me. Now that statement, I think about how much that must have scared Noah, because on some level Noah has to understand, hey, he's talking about me too. The end of all flesh, that I'm a part of that. The end of all mankind, well, I'm a part of mankind. But the good news of this story is God is offering a way of escape. He offers this ark of grace and mercy that mankind can find salvation on. And that's really what we're devoting our time to, talking about this in this episode. A little bit about what that ark was and a little bit about the God that gave instructions to it. I think it's fair to say that the ark is a boat, but probably not the way that we see boats in our day today. So, Elijah, you'd had some thoughts on that. Would you care to share us a little bit about what you see when you read about the ark?
All right, to begin with, let's see the dimensions here. In Genesis chapter 15, this is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. And make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit all high all around. Put a door on the side and make lower, middle, and upper decks. I am going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy life all under the heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on the earth will perish. And from reading the dimensions, we kind of give somewhat of an idea of not exactly what it may have looked like. And in the dimensions, there have been many scientific studies that have proven that that's actually the thing I did not mention was gopher wood. And to cover it, it's unknown if gopher wood was an exact species of tree, or if it was a type of manufacturing process, or if it was like a kind of wood,
right?
Species within it, And they cover it with pitch, which is the equivalent, to glue. It's been used all over. It's been used, in tool making, and it still is used, but it's been.
So one thing, as you read that, you mentioned that God gave instruction about a door. How many doors did he allow into this boat?
Well, he all he said was one door and one window, which that means that there is only like one door or one way to heaven, and it's through Jesus, and there ain't any other way.
I think that's fascinating. God says, look, there's a there's a certain dimension I want you to make it, which you've mentioned that dimension becomes is very stable. We can still test that today to see this is almost like it's perfect for a big extended stay out on rough water. He said, I want you to make a door, a window. I want you to build it out of gopher wood. Seems like God was really specific about what he wanted. And I think the Bible also kind of reveals a little bit of Noah's understanding of that. So in chapter 7 and in verse 5, what we find is Noah did according to all the Lord had commanded him. Again, in verse 9, makes the same statement that he brought these animals into the ark, 2 males, 2 females, as God had commanded Noah. And then verse 16, those that entered, male and female of all flesh, entered as God had commanded him, and the Lord closed it behind him. That even goes back to your point that there's only one way in, and it wasn't up to Noah. He might have been the one telling the world about it, trying to bring people to it, but he couldn't say, well, this guy laughed at me when I said I want to build an ark. This guy laughed at me when I said there was going to be a flood. He said, what is that? I'm going to keep them out. Well, the only one that could shut the door up was God. God's the one that closed it up behind them. And I think there's a fascinating example we see from Noah to say, I know who God is. I know that he is the only hope that I have. In fact, how merciful it is that the world was so bad and God said, I'm going to provide any way to escape it all. But Noah is trusting in God when he says, okay, exactly how you said to do it, that's how I'm going to do it. That's a picture of trust. That's a picture that I trust your ways. And I think a lot of people have a hard time doing that today, and partly because of stories like the flood. They say, well, how is it possible? How is it possible that a flood could just cover the entire world? And I think you studied a little bit about that too, hadn't you? The mechanics of the flood.
Yep. And I want to start that by saying that when people hear that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, people think that is all that happened, but we can tell from the scientific data that there was much more to it than that. And it speaks of the fountains of the deep bursting forth, and what creation scientists have said that is talking about plate tectonics, which you first learn about it in middle school, and it's real big in geology, which and not just tectonic plates. There would have been tsunamis that would have been the result of the plate tectonics. Like one of the ones you learn of is convergent, divergent, and I can't think of that one. I didn't mention this earlier, but there's evidence that it had never rained until the flood. And there's all sorts of theories out there of how God kept the earth stable, which that we've got no time to discuss, but they're out there. You can find them on YouTube. Answers in Genesis and Apologetics.
Two things you mentioned. One was the fountains of the great deep. It burst open. At least the way the New American Standard describes it in chapter 7, verse 11. And that happening, so exactly what that is. I think that's a great explanation of it, the tectonic plates moving, creating friction. It would have changed likely the face of the planet. What we see today, where continents and everything are at, very possibly wasn't what it looked like in the days of Noah. Everything was being changed by this great judgment that God was bringing upon the earth at that time. And the ark is his way of escape. The ark is what he's offered to bring mankind through that judgment to a place where they find peace or rest, specifically where they find a covenant. And that's what it describes later, is that God's going to, the flood waters are eventually going to subside. The ark will come to rest at Mount Ararat. And when it does, God enters into this covenant with Noah that is marked by the rainbow. And when we see that, we need to remember that rainbow is a reminder of God's peace. In fact, I've always enjoyed the description that it was, a bow is a warrior's bow. When God put that rainbow in the sky, it was as if he was hanging his bow up. He's not here to battle anymore. And so there's a lot of comfort in that. In fact, as we said, it's part of a larger narrative. Kind of think rebellion has happened. Finally, God cleaned the earth. Everything's been washed clean, and you have Noah, the faithful follower of God, and things are going to get better. But then following that up, we find that things don't get better. You immediately follow that up with this terrible account of Noah he plants a vineyard. He ends up getting drunk in that vineyard, and this account with his son Ham that is just tragic and terrible. What happens, and it really kind of leaves you wondering, when are things ever going to get better? It just seems like we get worse and worse. Things get a little bit better, and then goes right back. And you even mentioned, as we were talking before, just about the Tower of Babel. That's going to follow this pride and arrogance of mankind. And I think it's really not until Genesis 12 that we get an answer to that. The things are going to get better, and it's going to come through this man, Abram. God's going to make a promise to him that through his lineage, he's going to bring a child. Through his seed, there'll be one who comes that brings a great blessing to the entire earth. And it's through that lineage we see the emergence of Jesus. And I think an important part of understanding that is to understand God said, I'm not going to flood. That's that covenant. I'm putting my bow up. I'm not going to flood the earth again. But that doesn't mean judgment is never coming again either. I think you had some thoughts about that.
Yeah. We can tell through the New Testament passages that Jesus will be returning. We don't know when. Only the Father in heaven knows. And this time, the earth is still going to be destroyed. But this time it's coming with fire, not water. God's made a covenant that he will never flood the earth again with the rainbow. And, Jesus is the only way that we can be ready for this second destruction of the earth, and, through his plan of salvation. And another thing is, you mentioned how after the flood, the earth will never be the same. And, it never was the same before after it. There's the Ice Age would have followed due to, we can get into why later, but the flood has changed the earth forever. And, we've probably heard of the land of the supercontinent called Pangea, and that was what the earth was like. That was what the continents were like before, the fountains of the deep came, and, and the result of, the shifts in the plates that would have created our current.
Yeah. And if, to your point, if it changed the entire world in the flood, when God comes in judgment again, I think we should expect to see a change to the entire world again. He says it won't be with water, but we're told it will be with fire. And so certainly a huge change it would be seen in a worldwide fire, if you will. In fact, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 says, this is a plain indication of God's righteous judgment, so that you will be considered worthy of the kingdom of God, for which indeed you are suffering. For after all, it is only just for God to repay with affliction those who afflict you, and to give relief to you who are afflicted, and to us as well, when the Lord Jesus will be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, dealing out retribution to those who do not know God, and to those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus. So in that, it's really interesting. We maybe don't think of that as a flood narrative, but we have a depiction of God's judgment. We have a depiction of God's safety. And he says there's a salvation from this. And we also have an indication that there's a certain way. He says, those who obey, those who listen to the instruction that I've given. And that kind of brings us back to the ark. You know, you mentioned earlier, there's one door. There's only one way in. And I think John chapter 10 really is leaning heavily on that language whenever Jesus talks about being a good shepherd, talks about sheep that are searching out pasture to find better pastures, to find safety. And in John chapter 10, verse 9, Jesus makes this fascinating statement, I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved, and he will go in and out and find pasture. So Jesus is very much the door that God has offered, the door that is leading to the ark of safety. Jesus is that way that we are going to escape the judgment. And especially, that door is one that only God controls. I can't look at somebody in the world and say, well, they don't get to come in through that door. I don't like the way they looked at me. They don't get to come through the door. That door is open to everyone. But, you know, before we got started even recording, you mentioned a great point. One day, God's going to shut the door, just like he did with the flood. And so our responsibility today is just like Noah. We've heard the commandments of God, follow them. I think that is a fantastic place for us to start drawing this narrative to a close. One thing we might mention in closing is Peter, the apostle who followed Jesus for a big portion of his time as he ministered on the earth. He certainly was very close to Jesus, and he certainly learned a thing or two about obeying commands and even not obeying them. But he makes a really great statement in one of his pastoral letters. In 1 Peter chapter 3, he talks about this idea of the ark and of the flood. He says in verse 18, for Christ died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. In which also he went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, who once were disobedient, when in the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah, during the construction of the ark, in which that is 8 persons were brought safely through the water. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who's at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers had been made subjected to him. So he tells us there is an ark, there is a way into the ark, and we're not talking about escaping a physical flood, just like we're not talking about taking just simply a physical bath. We're talking about having hearts and consciences cleansed by the power of a merciful and grace-filled God who is promising that judgment is coming. As we consider that, I think we should consider how we need to enter through that door. Well, we thank you all so much for joining in. Elijah, do you have any other thoughts before we closed?
No, that's covered everything I'd like to.
Well, we hope that you all have enjoyed this, and we hope that you will take a moment to share it with your friends, maybe start a conversation with somebody today about the flood and about the great God of mercy who provided a way of salvation through it. Thank you guys for watching.